Okay. All right. I think we'll get started now. So if everybody's settled in, we'll let people enter the waiting room from the waiting room as they come in. But I think we can get started. So thanks again for joining us. Welcome. This is, whoops. Welcome to Drinking from a Firehose, Understanding and Innovating Complex Domains, featuring Lavi Kumar. This event is hosted by SDXD, San Diego Professionals Network. My name is Antonio, I'm the president, and we're a community globally of 5,100 UX practitioners across the world who gather regularly to connect, inspire, and learn. Big shout out to our event organizers. We couldn't have done it without you. And also a massive thanks to our event sponsor, ServiceNow. I'll hand it off to Tara, staff employee designer at ServiceNow, to tell you about this awesome company. So over to you, Tara.
Thanks, Antonio. So representing ServiceNow, we make the world of work better for everyone, focused primarily on enterprise workplace software. We've got a variety of different tools we work on. Internal mobility is also amazing. I recently switched to a people culture team and I'm working on defining my role with my manager. But yeah, we have a really great experience org culture that focuses on our UX designers, UX researchers, and product content or tech writer professionals. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks ServiceNow and Tara, thanks for talking about ServiceNow. So awesome sponsor. This wouldn't be possible without them for sure. So now some very short announcements. We do have a Slack channel. So you can join our Slack to see upcoming events. We also do job postings, event discussions, and we post event recordings from time to time. Sometimes even the actual slides from the event, depending on the event. And we'll put the link in the chat shortly, so feel free to join. And we're also right there, so if you want to contact us or if you have any questions, we're right there and ready to talk if you need to. So a little bit about tonight, we're going to have a great presentation by Lavi with a Q&A managed by Chantel, our head of program management, followed by an optional post-event networking session. So feel free to stay around, but no pressure. It's always nice to talk to everyone and discuss either the event or other UX related stuff. So without further ado, let me tell you a bit more about Lavi. Lavi is currently a product designer at ServiceNow, working in the ITX organization. Prior to her time at the company, she was a design consultant for IBM and traveled the world collaborating with clients using product design and design thinking methodologies. Outside of work, Lavi loves participating in design programs, both as a mentor and mentee. She also likes crafting and watching period dramas and documentaries, which seem to be like half of Netflix content nowadays. I also like them too. All right, so without further ado, thanks Lavi again for having your talk, and I'm really excited, so I'll hand it off to you.
Awesome, thanks Antonio, and thanks Tara for the intro as well. All right, let me share my screen. Can you all hear me okay? Just want to make sure. All right, let's see. Cool. I'm showing the right screen. Okay, awesome. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. And the reason I chose this topic is I think we've all been in this position of starting in a new company, being a new designer, or just joining a new team within the same organization. And especially within the enterprise software world, a lot of the domain spaces that we have to deal with are pretty technical, quite complicated. And so I kind of, paralleled it to drinking from a fire hose, right? And what are some methods that we can use to understand and innovate around complex domains? Funny story, last week we were doing a dry run of this talk and then the fire alarm went off. So that was kind of ironic, but anyway. So hopefully you'll find this useful. But yeah, feel free to save any questions for the end. We'll definitely, we should have time to go through all of those. So I think the first thing I wanted to talk about is, what we're all used to, or for many of us who have had the experience of going into the workplace, it's a really nice feeling when, you have your co-designer sitting right next to you within your business unit team, you have your engineers, PMs, you can just turn to either side and ask any questions about the domain that you may have. But given the reality of work today, what the more likely scenario is you're at home alone and your device is really your portal into understanding everything you can about the business unit that you're on. So it's definitely very challenging, especially for us as designers, many of us who have that design role and who are a lot more visual. This can be a challenge to understand the product that we're working on. And I think in the enterprise world, something that I've been noticing a lot more is the types of challenges designers have to face are a lot more technical. So we're asked to redesign for more database heavy experiences, back-end work, oftentimes translating legacy environments or user interfaces into something a lot more modern. And so understanding how a certain enterprise software has been used for years and years and years. Or there's even something around, design challenges around invisible interfaces, for example, wearables where there is no actual tangible UI or screens at all, but you still have to understand that end-to-end design experience. So really unique design challenges that we're all facing today. And then on top of that, trying to incorporate new concepts and new technology into these types of experiences. So, the challenge ends up being, hey, take this really complex domain and now throw in some ML or AI into it, or how can you make it cool and exciting? And I think that adds another layer of complexity as well, especially if you're a new designer joining a team. So this is something that I faced when I joined ServiceNow. And even though it was, I wasn't really an early career designer at the time, it was still a technical space, and I was trying to understand it as well as make it exciting for users to continue to use. And I think a lot of these challenges translate to any designer joining a new team. So one being you're trying to get time from experts, right? There are a lot of people that you can reach out to, that you're usually advised to reach out to, talk to users, talk to your PMs and certain stakeholders on the team, getting time from them. And they, of course, have a breadth of knowledge. I mean, it is pretty amazing that we have all these resources when understanding a technical domain. But then how do you stay organized with the information that you're getting from them? So you can set up a bunch of meetings, but how do you really digest that information and keep it organized? And then there's the next layer of, sure, the end users of a lot of these technical end-to-end workflows are, usually have some kind of developer role or are facing, more technical pain points that as designers, we usually can't relate to all the time. So how do you then create empathy for those users to then design for them? How do you then access competitor environments? Like oftentimes there's certain demos or environments that we don't have licenses or access to. And then ideating on top of that. So you now need to understand this entire domain and then create solutions on top of it. And then do all of this while onboarding to your new company. So not an easy thing, and I completely understand. So there's a couple things that I tackled when I was a new employee at ServiceNow. I think a lot of these are given, making sure that you understand the user and look at your competitors, but the way you go about them can be helpful given the type of company that you're at. So I'm going to talk through each of these in the context of my role at ServiceNow and more broadly in the context of a larger enterprise organization. And before I do that, I do want to give a quick background on the business unit that I work on. It is called IT Asset Management, specifically hardware asset management. And so what that is this is what it looked like when I started at the company. But what that is when you start at an organization, really any new company, typically, about a week before you start, imagine remotely, a week before you start, maybe your device shows up at your home in the mail, and you go get your device, your laptop, maybe you have a desktop, a keyboard and mouse. And then depending on your role, your IT asset manager will have all the right software installed on that device. So for example, for many designers on this call, and for myself, when I started at ServiceNow, I had a laptop sent to me. On that laptop, I had Adobe Creative Suite, I had Sketch, when we were using Sketch at the time, and I had Miro set up. So I had all the tools that designers would normally use because my IT asset manager knew, hey, she's starting as a designer, so these are the tools that she needs. And that way, on day one, when I was ready to start work, I opened up my laptop, I was good to go, I could start my job. So very high level, that's what IT asset management or hardware asset management is. It's getting your employees the right tools and knowing which employee has which device and what software they're using. When I started on ServiceNow and joined this team, that was my understanding of what my product was. But then as I dove deeper into the product, I realized that there is way more to it than I realized. You know, for example, if I request a specific type of laptop, it goes to the employee, it goes to the user using our IT asset management tool, and they have to figure out, okay, do I have this laptop for her in my warehouse in my building? Is there another warehouse I can ship it from? Do I need to go to Apple themselves and buy a new laptop? So that procurement is something that they need to figure out, and then they need to make sure it gets to me. And then they also need to keep track of how old my device is, so that when it reaches a certain age that they need to retire it. That way it's not hindering my work. If while I'm using my laptop, something breaks, maybe I spill coffee all over my keyboard, or I don't know, I'm getting a lot of glitches with the tool. How do I file a ticket? How do I make sure that ticket's followed up on? What are all of those sort of configuration management steps? That's like the area in purple, right? So there's managing the device when it's out of the user's hands, and then managing the device when it's in the user's hands. So there's a lot of intricacies to this as well. And understanding all of that was completely new to me. I didn't know, and many of us, you know, have no idea what goes behind the scenes. We're just happy to get our device when we started a new company. So there's a lot of work that goes behind it. So in a nutshell, that's what IT asset management is. And these are kind of the steps that I took to understand the ins and outs of it. So first one, being a student again. A lot of enterprise organizations offer some kind of course, like a fundamentals course is what it was at ServiceNow for customers. And they do this because this is like a good entry point for new customers. A ServiceNow employee, usually an expert in the field, will lead a course and teach customers all about what this new product is. And I was able to get into that course. It was like a 4-day intensive, and attend it as an employee. And what was nice is I learned and got to hear what all customers were hearing, but it also posed as like a focus group for me. So I was able to, you know, hear what customers were experiencing with their current asset management tools, and then also see what they were looking for. So it acted as a form of user research as well. And then what was nice is a lot of these organizations, or a lot of enterprise companies that offer this, usually they want to make it enticing to the customer and interesting. So they're not just going to throw information at you. They'll usually make it more assessment and activity based, so a little more interactive. What was important though is not just listening to this information, it was what I did with it. And so I made sure to capture all the slides and details around the slides that were presented in this course, document it, ask questions using Miro. And this ended up being not only a helpful tool for myself, but I then presented it to my wider team, and they were able to learn a lot more about hardware asset management than they had previously known before. So super great source of truth for your entire team, and a really great form of documentation. But just going back to basics and finding coursework is a really good way to start to understand a business unit. Also looking beyond customers. So who are your stakeholders within your business unit? Solution consultants are what we call them at ServiceNow. They're kind of the folks who interface with customers. So they're sellers in a way. And they are the bridge between the product team and the actual customer. So whenever our product team releases something, or if there's a new release, rather, they'll show that demo to the customer. So going to them and understanding, okay, what are you actually presenting to customers, getting documentation, white papers from them is also a really good resource. So I would definitely start there. And as I mentioned, I use Miro to document a lot of this work. There's a lot of other great sort of digital post-it note tools out there. But one thing I do want to stress, and I'll kind of go through this in each section, are the design thinking activities that you can use to document this. So ServiceNow is a fantastic set of design thinking templates, the enterprise design method, and a lot of larger companies are starting to create this practice as well. But many of these activities are also available. They might have slightly different names, but they're available online as well and easy to find. And so to capture your users and their actual needs and pain points, a persona map is really great. This is just an example of one that we use. And you can get there, as I mentioned, responsibilities, challenges, and motivations and goals. I also like using this usage and behavior metrics chart. And so it's kind of a nice bridge between design and business. So I'll usually fill this out with the PMs on my team and say, okay, I've created this foundation for understanding the business unit. Now, what are we tracking? What data are we currently tracking? What data do we want to track? What are some opportunities? And if we do track these particular data points, what are the outcomes that we'll get? So this sort of translates the experience to a sort of business strategy and design strategy viewpoint, and makes the conversation going forward a lot easier with your PMs. This is a good place to start in terms of understanding the domain and, as I said, sort of quote unquote being a student again. The next one is unpacking the information architecture. As I mentioned, kind of a given when you're starting on a new product. And I would say of the steps, this one was probably the most time consuming. It can be pretty tedious, right? So ServiceNow, when I started, kind of looked like this, at least the hardware asset management tool. And the first thing I did, or rather after I took the course, the next thing I did was break down the different components of it. So I knew there was like a series of navigation points on the left-hand side. There was also several tabs around the top. And then digging into each of those tabs, I saw that each of them had their own set of widgets and data visualization points. So if you look at all this, this is like 20 something pieces of data, shown in different ways. And I sat with my team and said, there's no way someone's gonna be able to dig into all of these and find exactly what they need. So how do we prioritize each of these data visualization widgets to not only give the end user what they need, but also help them complete their journey and tell that story in an effective way? And so, as I mentioned, the next thing I did is literally sat down and mapped out all of hardware asset management. So with, clicking on this tab leads to this widget, and this widget takes you to this page. And again, a great form of documentation for my internal team as well to learn about the tool. All of these are, end up being helpful for you, but as new hires have joined my team, they've been able to reference this as well. But one thing this also helped do, as I mentioned, was prioritize the to-be look and feel of the new iteration of the tool. So if you notice on the left, that's the entire IA map, but there's these colored blocks that we were then able to break up into different modules. And so that helped define the new hardware asset management experience. So you'll see that toward the end, what like today's experience looks like. But we were able to get to this point also using design thinking methods. So another really great asset for this is a prioritization jobs and tasks tool. So basically, this is a chart where you can map all of your different functionalities against importance to the user versus feasibility of implementation. And so things that are more towards, importance to the user, those are aspects you would want to prioritize because they bring the user value. But things that are also important to the user and easy to implement are pretty quick wins, right? These are things that, okay, I know I can put that front and center. That way, this is something that my engineering team will have a quick turnaround creating. It'll also bring value to the user. When I do this activity though, I don't disregard functionalities that are difficult to implement. I think those are still important to look at because you don't want to compromise, pieces of information that are valuable to the user. So I think this chart, it's a really good way to just map and organize and prioritize everything. But you can look at it as, oh, hey, if this is really easy to implement and brings value to the user, maybe I can put it in the top left corner of the page. So in terms of information architecture, that's like the first place the user will look, sort of like go through the page left to right. So this in combination with the user journey map, what I've mentioned earlier, is a really good way to then organize your page. So as I mentioned, prioritizing your different features and the different widgets, but also saying, okay, what is the first thing the user does when they're completing these tasks? As I mentioned, that would kind of maybe be in the top left corner of the page. It would be the first thing they look at. So always like to map out the user journey. And then I like this template a lot because it has this like emotion aspect toward the bottom. So when they're doing these tasks, how are they feeling? Is it stressful? Is this particular stage in their process we need to make a little easier? What opportunities arise for these parts of the journey? So I really like these two for prioritizing features and functionality. All right, next section, keeping things light. So what I mean by this is, you know, given that many of the business units or products that we work on are pretty technically heavy, how can you make things just a little lighter and more interesting in the creative process? So I often like to create these like caricatures or personas in storyboard form when I'm trying to understand the business unit. And the reason I do this is because it just helps me understand, understand the domain, but also create empathy around what that user is going through. If I'm just looking at, screens that they work on, or if I'm just talking to the user, I can kind of gain some empathy, but then if I try to translate it into my own words through, more visuals, like something that as a designer I can relate to more, it just helps the process. So it allows me to just have a little more fun in a more technical or rigid space, and then put the concepts that I've learned into a more storytelling effort, whether that's through these 6-frame storyboards, adding personas, emotions, quotations, etc. And not just sticking with this is what the current journey is, but using this method through ideation as well. So I usually like to do an as a scenario, then do sort of a to be. So what are we going to be creating as a team? And then doing more of like a, 5 to 10 year journey, something a little more blue skies, not really keeping feasibility in mind, just to push the creative juices and make the experience more interesting for me as a designer as well. And yeah, to be honest, when you do present all 3 journeys, your team will usually say, okay, well, we can't do the last one just given the time frame. But I think it's very good practice as a designer to always do vision work, just to get individuals excited about your business unit and product down the road. Kind of opens the possibilities for the scope of your business unit and your product. And so ServiceNow has storyboarding templates, and a lot of individuals I think shy away from this step because they're afraid to draw, or they're not comfortable in this particular stage. And so what's really cool is it's so easy to find iconography online. And you notice there's like emotions that you can drop into different stages to be able to tell your story better. It's a nice way to not just jump to solutioning either. You're still a little high level in terms of the interface, but still making sure you're, as I mentioned, gathering empathy for the end user. What's also great about these storyboards is they continue to 6 frames. And I think that's important because if you feel like your storyboard ends up being like 12 or 15 frames, it probably means the problem you're solving for in this single experience is just a little too large. And so in this stage, it's pretty intentional that they're 6-frame storyboards. And then another particular tool that I found useful in this stage is what I call a hypothesis statement. So it essentially takes your storyboard, the way I like to use it at least, is it takes the storyboard and condenses it into a single statement. So we believe that by creating this experience, it's going to result in this particular KPI or metric, and we will be validating this by, XYZ. So user research, survey, talking to users, etc. So oftentimes if you see in those last 2 storyboards I have there, those like clusters of Post-its in the top, those are basically how might we statements, hypothesis statements that I've used to define each of those storyboards. So another good activity during this stage to kind of define what exactly you'll be creating. Competitive analysis, also really great way to understand your domain. The one challenge though has, usually with enterprise software been, how do I just get access to different competitors? Sometimes if you're, depending on the PM you're working with, they will have some, demo licenses that you can look at. Oftentimes it's not the case, and I've just honestly turned to YouTube. There's someone's giving some kind of demo on YouTube, even though it's a little more lightweight, but you can just go use that as a resource, take screenshots and come back to your team. But I think what you do with those screenshots is really important. And so what I found really helpful is putting them in context of a user journey. And so I made kind of a more finalized user journey that you can see in the top there. And then I dropped the different competitor screens in context of the different user journey stages. And so what that ends up showing you is, okay, like when I look at the hardware asset management user journey, we start with dashboards, and a lot of competitors were starting their experience with dashboards, which is fine. It doesn't mean you have to be different. It just means that clearly they've done research too, and this is a good entry point for users. Everyone wants to start with the dashboard to get high level information, but there was a little bit of gap in terms of this functionality called normalization. So that means not a lot of competitors have tackled that pain point, and that's a good opportunity that we can use as well. So I like placing competitor screenshots in the context of a user journey because it just shows what areas are missed opportunities versus which areas are, areas that you can continue to explore. ServiceNow has this feature comparison. So I actually have not, this particular design thinking activity I've not used for my project, but I've heard really good things about it. Feature comparison is really nice where you have your list of competitors maybe across the left, features across the top. You kind of just map out using this sort of like heat map strategy of, hey, this competitor's done a really good job in this area, or not so great a job in this area. So super useful tool to then just get a quick visual and figure out which areas you can take for inspiration versus which ones you want to work on a little more. Or I think you all have seen this, classic SWOT analysis is really helpful in this stage as well to learn about how other organizations are maybe tackling a similar problem. Cool. And then the very last section, finding delightful moments. The reason I wanted to include this is it kind of goes into it's now transitioning away from that understanding your product area, but then how do you solution and ideate around it to keep things a little more interesting. There's a lot of ways to do it. I think these are some of the tactics that I took and I'll show examples of each one in hardware asset management. But I based a lot of this on something that I'm sure many of you have heard Paul Hong speak, but he kind of promoted this in our organization, the AAA principle, automate, augment, and amaze. And so what this kind of means is, what are ways in your current experience where you can add automation, where things are automatically done for the user, information is automatically populated, augmentation, where information is surfaced to the user that makes their job easier or makes them feel like they're able to accomplish a lot more than if they didn't have any assistance. And then amazement or delight, what are ways that you can create delightful moments. So, I remember the classic example of when 404 pages started to get really fun in sort of the tech world. If your website crashes or if you go to a wrong page, people were having a lot of fun with the design of those. So it's little things like that. When something goes wrong or something's a little bit technical and dry, that you can add elements to just sort of amp up the whole experience. And I think as designers, these are just good methods to keep in mind because it helps make our design process, especially designing for enterprise spaces, a lot more interesting. So, for example, I try to not overly do it, but when applicable, look into methods of maybe gamification. And I think this is pretty and a pretty applicable concept in a lot of enterprise spaces. So if, for example, asset managers often have to fill in missing information, and it's a very integral part of their job, but it can get a little bit tough to keep, adding in hey, this model number of this laptop is missing or this manufacturer. So trying to say, hey, if you just take 5 minutes, you can increase your information bank from 90 to 95%. So, saying you're almost there, adding slightly more fun elements to it. Where in ServiceNow, when I started, this was not present at all. It was just throwing data points and widgets at them. This was adding a suggested actions area to sort of encourage them and make their job a little bit more interesting. They're sort of like trying to achieve goals. So this was one augmentation principle I tried out when ideating. And this also just helps with the ideation process in general. Pre-population of forms, super simple concept to integrate and kind of falls into this automation aspect. Really simple concept to try and implement. Like, where are opportunities where if I'm taken from page A to page B, I can carry information over to make that experience a little bit more seamless. So pre-population of forms wherever is possible. In this case, this asset record, we were linking from another page to this asset record, which has a lot of a pretty heavy form view. How much of that information could we carry over? So that was something I always tried to promote when designing and talking to the engineering team. Again, another augmentation, as I mentioned, the asset manager's job is to fill in missing information. Typically, they had to go manually see which fields were missing or which ones were empty. And so the small action of just like calling out an empty field to them through that error state that you see really helped a lot, just because they got to this page and they were able to quickly see in each view, okay, which field was missing, and through that eye-catching UI, be able to add that information in. So again, a pretty simple one but goes a long way. Another one was, as I mentioned, another key task of the asset manager is to source devices. So if you request a device, they need to figure out, should I source it from my local stockroom? Do I need to transfer it from another stockroom, or do I have to purchase it from the vendor? So they have to make that decision pretty quickly. But are there ways we can tag the different options to tell them, hey, if you source it from this location, it's actually going to be the fastest option. Or if you source it from this location, it's the cheapest option. So adding these tags to their and sort of making that decision for them really improves the experience. And so trying to look for ways to automate and augment as well and improve their decision making is a really beneficial way of improving the design. And then in this particular experience, this was super simple. The user was just in a view, and because we were trying to merge like the older ServiceNow UI and the newer one, when they clicked on and completed this particular UI action, they were actually going to be taken to a new browser tab. A new browser tab was just going to open. Imagine doing that without any warning. It's a little annoying and frustrating, just being taken away from your old screen into this new browser tab. But unfortunately, there was no technical workaround because of the backend systems that we were using. And so I proposed, okay, let's just be clear to the user before this big jump happens, what's going on, like why we have to do this, and adding a illustration. And so I talked to our visual design team, and I was able to work with them to get a custom visualization that says, hey, we're just going to be opening a new tab. You know, your work won't be lost, but this is why we're doing this experience. And so just that, you know, little bit of hand holding into why what was happening was really helpful to the user. Another thing that, you know, I've seen a couple teams try out in ServiceNow is whenever a user completes a really key task, like confetti kind of shows, like blows up on the screen, which is really cute. So little things like that, I think, minor interactions, but they again help kind of ease the user's experience in case there's an error or something goes wrong, or you need to work around a more technical issue. So one challenge though with these AAA principles is the feasibility aspect, right? They're not always that easy to implement. And so I'm bringing back this prioritization chart because you can then design for a lot of these principles, but then map out again and say, okay, which of these are actually feasible to implement? And it's okay if some of them end up kind of falling off. Because the time to implement is a little bit too difficult. You know, you can save them for the next release or use it for vision work, because it's always good when showing these concepts to get the team excited about what you could create for your enterprise experience. And so I think this chart is just really good to bring back at this point as well, to understand which features you want to prioritize. But we were able to kind of go from this ServiceNow experience that I showed at the beginning, using a lot of the methods earlier, to ServiceNow today. So a lot more colorful, lot better with call to action so that the user, when they come to this page, knows exactly what to do. All those visualizations I mentioned before are kind of condensed into a single page, so a lot easier to read without having to click into all these tabs. And I think it's definitely resonated a lot better with users. And so, wrapping up, when you are faced with a larger enterprise domain space, you're joining a new team, look to any internal coursework that your organization provides. If there isn't anything, turn to other stakeholders in your team, or see if your company partners with any learning resources. So I think we use LinkedIn Learning, so there's a lot of great assets on LinkedIn Learning so that I could understand IT asset management. Unpacking the information architecture is another great tool. Can take some time, especially if you are dealing with a pretty heavy space, but is just a great way to visualize the entire tool that you're working on. And keeping things light. So this is in the context of personas. So now taking your business unit or your product and then turning into a story through persona diagrams and emotions through sketching as well. And then, using the stage that you don't quite have to jump into an actual UI, but using that storyboard methodology. Researching your competitors and comparators. So understanding how other competitors are, in using the space as well, and seeing how that maps to your current flow. And so that shows areas of opportunity or maybe common areas that you can leverage for inspiration. And then finally, finding or copying delightful moments. So I think there's no shame in, and I'm sure many designers have talked about this, seeing how other consumer applications or other enterprise applications are creating delight in their end-to-end experiences and leveraging those for inspiration. But also it just helps to look into ways to automate, augment, and amaze so that when you're designing and your day-to-day involves like being in this heavier enterprise space, then you can basically find ways to make the experience a lot more delightful, and it makes your job as a designer a lot easier. So with that, I think that's all I have. I do have some resources here. I think we are sharing this out. So yeah, that's all I have for you today. So what questions are there?
Yeah, thank you so much, Natalie, for your presentation. This is really, really helpful. Like I totally feel like I learned a ton today, especially a lot of like UX designers now are, working in the tech industry. A lot of times oftentimes we face some really complicated projects. Even when I work for the company for a year, sometimes when I switch to a new project or a new page, I feel like it's just like a totally different subject matter. So I had to, start learning from the scratch. So with those guidance, those methodologies you share, I think it's really help us to, get up to speed to understand what we are designing for. So really great presentation.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, so before we dive into the Q&A section, I just want to remind everyone, you can just type your question in the chat, or you can just DM me in the chat so we can go over those questions one by one. So the first question we had is from Dan. The question is, for the prioritize job and task, time to implement is determined with input from devs or just a best guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, easier said than done. I always say get engineering involved as early as possible. So if you can, from the time you're creating your wireframes or you're thinking of sort of vision work, you can get them involved and show them what you're making, that they can help judge feasibility. It's not easy to always get their time, right? Because they're usually working on like the current release. And so typically your PM can try and speak to that. But yeah, I would say, if possible, don't do it in a silo. It's definitely good to get them involved because they can speak to feasibility better than most. But yeah, what ends up sometimes happening is, they revisit feasibility a little bit later into this project cycle. And so you end up creating these designs and you kind of have to be able to pull back. So that's why I always like to design with, with all possibilities in mind, or create multiple versions so that you have versions you can fall back on in case time for implementation ends up being an issue.
Yeah, that's kind of what I like to do is like I will have a spectrum of options from like quick wins to all the way to like the revamp or like the large initiatives like for the long-term solutions. So I think it's always, you know, to think about how the business can work with like different like development teams. Sometimes like we think it's gonna take a quick we think it's like an easy task, but sometimes it's really hard to fix some like back end stuff. So yeah, I totally agree. Like we should involve like engineering team like as soon as possible.
Yeah.
And the next question is from by Pay. The question is, how do you create a hypothesis statement? Is by one person or the whole team? If it's by the whole team, who's involved with it?
Yeah, same, kind of similar to the previous, you know, going through that prioritization grid. As interdisciplinary as you can get with completing any of these design thinking activities is always the best. With that hypothesis statement, I think if anything, at least getting your PMs involved, and I think user research is really great too, because that one had, you know, this is the particular functionality we're trying to tackle, and if we are able to achieve this, this is the KPI we'll be able to achieve. So your PMs can help speak to that. And then there's that second part that said we will validate by doing X, Y, Z. And so that's where user researchers can be really beneficial to say, hey, I think this is a great opportunity to do usability testing or maybe more generative research. And so they can take the hypothesis statements to then help generate like a research script. So always, yeah, you know, as interdisciplinary as possible for doing that activity as well. But at the very least, you know, design, PM, and research probably would be a good one.
Okay, yeah, thank you for sharing that your knowledge. The next question is from Antonio. He's asking, can you elaborate on how information architecture can review the look and feel of the app?
Yeah. So I think not only just like a tool for understanding, but I think mapping out your IA can then help you realize placement. There's a lot of really cool research out there on like what types of navigation are like easiest to understand. You know, people have done analysis like heat mapping tests on left hand and top, or like double left hand, like a stacked left hand navigation, like a tree navigation on the left, or like a stacked navigation on top. And so I think when you map out the IA, you can kind of get a sense of, okay, based on how I'm prioritizing the different aspects of my information architecture, what's the best layout for my new product as well. And so I think it's not only a tool for understanding, but it can definitely influence the design that you're creating. So I would, yeah, you know, what I would do is when you map out your current IA and do prioritization, just always like go out and see what common IA patterns are out there that other enterprise software tools do. I think we're really lucky at ServiceNow to have a platform team that's done a lot of that research for us. And so whenever I design for my particular business unit, I just take, you know, the template that exists. I don't have to think about it too much. But, you know, I think that a lot of smaller organizations probably haven't done that much research, but I think if you're in a larger team, you know, you can rely heavily on like your design system or platform team to have done that work. And it's really cool to, you know, maybe ask them, be like, how did you get to this point? And they can probably point you to some useful resources.
Yeah, totally. I wish our team has some sort of templates that can just pull and mapping out the information architecture. But I'm sure like a Figma or other like design software might have some sort of like open source templates or like a plugin even. So maybe that's something we can do some research about that. So yeah, and that's kind of leads to my next questions. When you say like some small like teams don't have the templates like you have, so I'm just curious, what's your suggestions? Well, when working with a small team with limited resources, when you just don't have the time to go through those discovery phases?
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think discovery can be done in a lot of ways. Like it's definitely not necessarily defined as formal design thinking activities. Before ServiceNow, when I was at IBM, my team was a lot smaller. We kind of operated like a startup, so we're working very quickly. And so when I was on a new project, I would take like an hour or two to just like my quick form of discovery was just Googling competitors. So that's a form of discovery. And then talking to the actual client for like another 30 minutes to an hour was another form of discovery. So that was just, as much as I could do to gather information. And then typically I always have like template questionnaires that I like to put together. And so these are sort of standard sets of questions that I'll ask every client. And I've translated a lot of that to what I do at ServiceNow. I have like a standard template that I use when I have my very first meeting with the PM. And so it's just a way of doing discovery work as well. So yeah, I think quick forms of discovery are Googling competitors, talking to a client if that's an applicable situation for you. And then, doing like very quick research if possible, depending on the end user. If it's something that's doesn't have a really niche end user, some things that I've done, I have just like printed out my wireframes and I've gone around to other folks in the office and just gotten feedback. I think that's a really helpful way as well. It's a sort of like post-implementation discovery work, but I agree, it can be a little bit of a challenge. And then what's tough too when you're a smaller team is like taking time to define practices that are repeatable. A lot of larger enterprise teams have the luxury of having like an operations team to do that, which is amazing. And so when you're smaller, that's definitely not as much of a luxury. But I would say another tactic is design thinking activities are all over the internet. Like you just need to Google them and you will find so many resources of templates that you can use. These are just the ones that ServiceNow is kind of standardized, which is really nice. But there are many variations on a lot of them that you can easily find online.
Yeah, totally. Like, I think we don't have to go through like every single like exercise in the discovery phase. It's just based on what team and what resources you use. You just leverage what's the best for the team and yourself as well.
It's just like imagine like it's just a set of ingredients and you're sort of just putting together your own recipe based on like how much time you have and what resources you have.
Yeah, it's kind of the toolkit. You just like a pool, like
exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then we have a question from like Chris Park. He's asking, seems like you spend a lot of time unpacking the IA. So how did you convince the stakeholders that you need to spend that much time on this? Did stakeholders feel that it is beneficial, and how long did the IA take?
Yeah, I think I got lucky. Because I just started at the time of this project. So they were saying like, oh, she's still onboarding, it's fine. And I would, use that time to really go through the product and map everything out. I think when you don't have that time, or if you need buy-in for that, trying to leverage it as, has anyone mapped out this entire product before? Like, do we really know the ins and outs of it? So saying I'm creating an artifact for future designers or for future team members can help, because it's something you're taking time to create something that's sort of long lasting, is one method. And that can kind of help to create buy-in for that time. And also, if the PM on your team is making a request for a certain redesign of an experience, but they aren't able to narrow down what exactly they want to redesign, then this is, I think the argument kind of wins itself, is I need time so that I can fully unpack the IA and then help you figure out how you want to narrow down. Because if you're not giving me a clear answer now, how are we supposed to even start this whole thing? So I think that's just one argument you can use. But sometimes PMs will come in and have a very clear scope of what they want to work on. So then you can just map out information architecture just for that. So it kind of depends on the angle the PM's taking as well.
Yeah, that's a good strategy on like how to push back on PM when sometimes they don't even know what they want. Like,
yeah.
Give me more time so I can figure out what you want.
Right, like let me help you. Yeah, figure that out.
Yeah, exactly. And then we have another question from Dan. The question is specifically to your IA discussion. there, I noticed redesign ServiceNow dashboard, compact the left sidebar to just icons, remove the immediate text explanation of what the icons link to. How you found the successful or backup by studies you mentioned, and does that rely on tooltips or for the new users, like how user can understand those icons?
Yeah. We do have tooltips for those. I think, and again, kind of falls into the purview of our platform team. Tara, I don't know if you know more about this, but I believe that they've definitely done research, showing that the icons sufficed. They captured, and what's cool is any team that's doing that sort of migration from that classic or that original ServiceNow look to this new one with just the icons, you have to go through a review process. And so the team will look at your new designs and make sure that whatever you're placing on the left-hand side are very common actions. You've sort of broken down the tool into different sections that the end user would be very familiar with. But to supplement that, yeah, we do have tooltips. And when you click on each one, it's like very clear in the title what that section is. And so for asset management specifically, when we validated this, we've gotten really great feedback. People are like, yeah, it makes sense how you broke it down. I can't speak for all teams, but I imagine that it's resonated really well. And it kind of just makes the whole experience feel a lot more breathable.
Yeah, I think sometimes the icons can get a little bit tricky if you don't use it right. So in my company, we have some sort of like hidden rule is whenever you use the icon, you have to place a text right next to that. You can't just use like the icon stand alone unless it's really common use like a check or close, things like that. But other than that, you have always place a text. I think like a different company may have different strategy there. So that's really interesting to know.
Yeah, no, that's good feedback. And yeah, sometimes it's not gone well where like the icon I've chosen, I thought made sense because I've been more familiar with the space, but it was not at all. It didn't hit the mark for the text. So yeah, I think that's good feedback and can sometimes not work out well. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I also have a question, like earlier you mentioned like an invisible interface. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Like what's your suggestion on design those invisible interface?
Yeah, I personally, like for ServiceNow in the product area that I've worked on, have had, being like at the end of the day, creating software solutions, have always had UI to design off of, which has been nice. But I've definitely talked to other designers who maybe designed for like Fitbit or I mean, there is still like a smaller screen, but if you imagine the real experience with some of those wearables is there's a lot of like tactile experiences involved in terms of maybe notifications or how you interact with the device, like through like vibration or sound. So they need to think about the experience of the user when they're not looking at their device. What does that end-to-end journey look like? Because that's very much a part of the experience as well as the time that they are looking at their actual screen. And so that's kind of what I mean by invisible interfaces is for designers having to design around the times when they're not looking at an actual screen. And I think that's really prevalent with wearables. That's like, or like Alexa or Google, my Alexa just went off, sorry. Or Google voice, yeah, you're not looking at anything when you're interacting with this voice tool, but the experience is still very rich based on sound feedback and like little lights and everything. So I think that poses a whole new set of challenges, but also a very cool space to design around.
Yeah, and that kind of just inspired me. Like maybe I can also add some vibration to some of the interactions I'm working on. So yeah, thank you for pointing me out. I just never thought of like that's something we can also explore on. Yeah. So do we have any other questions? I think we just go through all of the questions and then we're right on time now. So I'm gonna head back to Antonio. Is he still trying to unmute himself?
Yeah, sorry. We just got one last question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Um,
just posting. So I just joined a complex domain, so simply understand the users themselves takes pretty long. However, the team can just wait for me to bring up innovation solutions and design deliverables. So when some decisions are made by the team, developers start to implement the draft first. The order is totally opposite. When you just start your career in a complex industry, how did you catch up to understand the concept?
Okay, sorry. So question is like, it's being
I think-
implemented first.
Mhm.
I think at least what I understand, sometimes when you it's supposed like a designers to discover and provide the design solutions, and then the dev team start implement that. But he's working on like a small team, like the team just can't wait for him to provide the solution. So they start implement first. So it's doing the opposite. So he's wondering, like, when you just start your career in a complex industry, how did you catch up to understand the concepts? Yeah.
No, that's a good question. Yeah, I would kind of jump to user testing and user research. And so what you could do is, work with your team to get customers or users to look at what's currently being implemented, but don't just start the feedback session with showing them what the developers created and getting a bunch of feedback on the UI. See if you can split the session into generative first. So you're almost like using half the session for your own benefit and for discovery to understand what maybe their day-to-day tasks are, and what some of their pain points and motivations are. So you're like doing the things you would do if there was no UI at all. And then for the second half of that session, then you can show them what's being created. So you're almost like tackling two birds with one stone, because I imagine if they've already started implementing, the team is already really tight for time. So when you're doing any kind of research in parallel with them implementing, can you also use that as a way for you to understand the domain as well? Would probably be, I think, a good approach. Also, I think just pull the rest of your like this is what I do a lot. And it is nice that we have like such a large experience organization in ServiceNow, but I'll just reach out to other teams that maybe have very similar UI or experiences and say like, hey, how did customers respond to this? Or did you run into a situation where you had to implement first, and how did you tackle that? So just pooling your design network within your organization, because ultimately you do want to, between different business units, you want to make sure that you're creating similar experiences as well. So I think they're also a great resource.
Great. That's a great suggestions. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks Chantel for managing the Q&A. That was great. And Lavi, you just had like all the answers. So amazing. Yeah, it was awesome. And yeah, and I just really like that a lot of this, I think when we were talking about this, it's a lot of stuff that is actionable the next day. I mean, definitely there's some maybe constraints depending on your team size and other stuff, but there's a lot of really good techniques to just get you started. And I also feel, depending on the company, onboarding is really good or average or not, or maybe not existent. So this is a good DIY and maybe implementation of your own. This could be maybe a thing in your maybe yearly review of how you implemented like an amazing onboarding experience for your team or yourself, really. So yeah, really thanks a lot. Thanks to everyone for the questions and for joining us. Really good questions. They really dove deep into the details, and even had some questions building and other questions. Crazy. So yeah, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks Lavi again. Thanks for the SDXD board. Thanks ServiceNow. And yeah, I think that's it. We can cut it up there. I don't know, Lavi, if you have anything to promote or if you want people to find you.
Yeah, no, thank you all. Great questions. I agree with Antonio. It's really good discussion. I feel very lucky to be working at ServiceNow. We have a lot of great resources and, a lot of things in place that make my life as a designer easier. Yes, I just saw this come in. I think we are sending the slides out, Antonio. Yeah. But I was also in a position before I joined the company where I was in a much smaller team and had to do a lot of this work myself. And so I think to Antonio's point, if you don't have a lot of these resources in place, it's a good way to try and, at least start some kind of practice within your team. Use that as like a promotional project as well. Like, look what I was able to put into place because, my team was strapped for resources and time, but I was still able to onboard a new designer, or I was able to do all this discovery work, which is then being used as a resource for new designers joining. So yeah, I just want to say, like what I'm describing now is the case in a lot of larger companies. I know it's not always the case though, and all of you probably have really different experiences, but I think a lot of these things are also available to use elsewhere. So, don't feel like just because you don't have the immediate resources on your team, you can't do this kind of work. But no, really appreciate the questions and thank you all, and thanks SDXD for the opportunity. This was fun.